In a world that often pulls us apart, More in Common brings us back to what matters. Hosted by Garen Taylor and Keith Richardson, this isn't your average podcast. It's a challenge to think deeper, question louder, and grow further. At More in Common, we work with NFL teams, tech companies, and professionals across industries to improve communication and foster compassion. And with a focus on emotional intelligence, we aim to bring a wealth of experience to help you navigate the complexities of human connection. We've never been more connected and yet more isolated. We want to explore the roots of that tension and offer a way back to what we all need: real human connection. Enjoy the show. Times when I'm singing in the car, because boy, I'd really like to belt out in the car.
I bet.
I can really get a consistent, I can't hide myself. But it depends on the song I'm singing. Yeah. But if I have to go up and talk in a higher, it comes off squealy, at least in my head. I've never actually listened to myself sing back, so I am kind of glad with. But it's not. No, it's not. It's not. We're going to hear you. Hey, look, listen to the end, because at the end, Garen is going to put in his karaoke at the basketball game halftime show, if he can find it.
A little context, because everybody wasn't here for our prep conversation. But yes, the other night at the Tijuana Zonkies game, I was invited to participate. It's a great name, right? I was invited to participate in the halftime karaoke. They actually pulled me out of my seat. I wasn't even like down low or anything. I was like up in the uppers. And they were like, "Hey, do you want to participate?" And I was like, "Don't threaten me with a good time, lady." And it was rock night too. So I chose Chili Peppers, By the Way. And not to spoil it, but I won.
You won.
You'll see at the end if you hang out for the rest of this episode. If you're watching,
gotta hang out.
I guess you'll just hear it if you're listening.
Yeah, and I mean, look, maybe you just fast forward, but I want to start this episode off a little bit differently. I'm gonna take some notes from friends of ours. If you like the content that we put out, and our audience is growing slowly but surely, we would love to grow it some more, because we think anyway that the topics and guests that we bring on this show are wildly informative, and but that's why we do this. Give us a comment in your favorite podcatcher app, because apparently the algorithm really values comments and in the value that we provide. So the more comments we can get, the more we can spread the word in a more easy fashion. So anyhow, what are we talking about today, G?
I like that. Well, we've been on this arc, you and I both, for the show, I think, and kind of interpersonally for stuff going on in our lives, about looking at masculinity and how to define masculinity and how masculinity presents in our everyday lives. And with everything going on now, I mean, especially like war and stuff, it makes you really reflect about how we got here, and what's coming down the road.
Yeah. So I am curious, because point in time, we bring Nick on for 3 episodes, had a great conversation from a sociological standpoint and a personal experience perspective as well, right? I think Nick was such a tremendous guest to help us explore this. And we had Zach on to talk about his experience in working with us, and then, having Kelly on to talk about the generational impact, though it wasn't necessarily tied directly to masculinity. There are certainly some significant takeaways from that as it relates to this topic. But what I'm curious about from your perspective is, in particular, like, I didn't have to sell you very hard on that conversation with Nick. We didn't. It's something that's been in my mind for about a year, and this year it just felt right to start an open conversation about it, given, you know, Going to War, Scott Galloway's book, and his narrative around it. What about the conversation appealed to you?
I think that it's always something that I've looked at in the sense that for me, defining masculinity and defining manhood always had to do with kind of choosing the most valuable aspects that you thought that you want to emulate and trying to make those your everyday values that you live by and how you act, right? But I find a lot of this boisterous, very aggressive tonality and posturing to be so performative. Like it's a mask that people put on, and usually it's a mask that people put on to hide some other sort of hurt, right? Some other sort of feeling of unacceptedness or outsiderness that they're usually trying to cover up with a bravado. Uh, and seeing so much of that lead to so much harm, both how people are outwardly toward one another and what people do to themselves for it, is why it's something that I've been thinking about and considering and especially talking about, right? And wanting to talk about. Um, I think
Mm,
people put a lot of judgment on themselves and it restricts how you can interact with your world around you when you have these kind of strict formations of I gotta be a man, so I can't cry or I can't ask for help or you know what I mean, or seek therapy. Or what I also see happen a lot, and especially around these kind of conversations, is someone else is to blame for the ills or the problems or the things that you experience, and that's very dangerous to me. It's very dangerous rhetoric. It's a dangerous path to get on. Uh, we were talking in previous episodes about what Scott Galloway says on these ideas and how it can lead to loneliness and people just need to get out more. But I think there's also a much darker and uglier side to that. Um, that worries me a lot.
mm. So, from the perspective of having these conversations, what value do you think it brings to others?
Yeah, well, I think that none of this gets solved without us talking about it amongst ourselves. People need to share ideas, right? The marketplace of ideas, like John Stuart Mill, is probably the idea that in the exchange of ideas is where we sharpen the ones that we have, criticize the ones that may not work as well, and make better ideas, make better plans out of things. By pretending like it doesn't exist or there's only one way to be, you don't necessarily get to the best, right? Like this is how diversity in any opinion sort of works. If you're only looking at something from one way, then is that really the best way? Or are you just doing it because that's what you've always done? And I see
Mm,
that a lot in these forms of traditional performative toxic masculinity. Like we were talking about the bravado or the be willing to dismiss or hurt or cause pain or you know what I mean? Just to do it for the sake of doing it. Sometimes it doesn't even feel like it has real thought out justifications. It's more of like a lashing out. And the value to me of making sure that we have these conversations is that we can stop doing that. You know, we can stop as I mentioned earlier, hurting ourselves and hurting others for a type of performative masculinity that is made up and doesn't need to exist in the way that we see it now. And not to put too fine of a point on it, but there's a thing happening now in this war where Pete Hegseth is like, we're taking the gloves off our war fighters and there's no rules of engagement. We're trying to create the most harm possible. But like those rules of engagement are there for everybody. And what you don't want is to be on the wrong side of that. So, is this masculinity that you're performing actually making anybody safer or stronger? Or is it actually putting more people at risk, not only to do things to other people that are harmful, but also putting them their own selves in harm's way? And it just feels like not that well thought out to frame things like that going into situations like this. And if we don't have these conversations amongst ourselves, I don't necessarily know that people recognize that as it's happened.
oh, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think, for me, why it's been so, I don't know, top of mind is, and why I was really excited to have Nick on from a sociological perspective, is he used a word and we didn't dive into it too much. The masculinities, right? Like the the different ways men can show up in the world. And for me personally, I've never, this is a weird thing to say and we can explore it, identified as a man. Like I'm just a person that goes around with different anatomy than others, and it's just not something I've ever gravitated towards. Not like, "Oh, I need to act a certain way because I am a man." And so I've always just kind of floundered and tried to figure out where I fit in, and never really fit in those traditionally masculine spaces. And I think that ends up leading to why I've found this to be such a valuable conversation. I'm glad someone like Scott Galloway is talking about it in a different way than traditionally has been talked about. But I also think this, to your point, is the limitation of Scott Galloway's perspective is he is trying to ring fence it. And we touched on it a little bit with Nick. Like, is it important to define it? And and for me, I just struggle so much because I know so many different types of men, right? That carry different types of social influence and social impact, whether that's social on their family or, so, there are families where there's the traditional male role I'm friends with, and that works for their family. Then there's families like mine where the traditional male role isn't, I'm the emotional support in our family, and that works for our family. But what that means is that I've had to discover and uncover the the people that I belong with. You, as an example, Rodney. For those who have
Shout
listened
out to
to
Rod.
shout out to Rodney. We still got to get him on this show. And now that we're recording during the week, maybe we will. Um, and being able to navigate, like, create this area. And we've talked about this a lot, especially last year, meeting people where they are, open to listen more, the more philosophy. Like, just creating space for people to show up in a meaningful way without this expectation that you have to be a certain way just because you have a different anatomy than half the population, right? And there has to be some predefined expectations of you. And what that does with those predefined expectations, if you don't meet them, you can feel alienated and isolated, and that can lead to, as we see, loneliness and impact. And I'll share this story and then I'll pause to hear your thoughts to continue this conversation. We'll call him a friend, acquaintance. Like, we weren't super close, but we did some work locally together in the local community. And I'm not going to put this all on masculinity, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff here. He's a dad of two young kids. And he, a week ago, took his own life. And, you know, we, we went to the viewing and the services and had a conversation with a family member, and their response was like, you don't he was just at this thing and he seemed so happy. He was always around and he seemed so happy. Um, he was doing all of these things that, and in it, he seemed like he was really living purposefully and doing that. And yet he still took his own life. And it's such a shock to our community because it is that moment of, wow. And then you say you never know what's going on with somebody. And if we can't create space where, even if it's unspoken, that someone can come to you and say, like, this is how I'm feeling. And we can have I can create safety for you in that without judgment. Um, Especially as men, where we're not necessarily supposed to be, from the cultural definition, the vulnerable crier in a dynamic and in a relationship. I'm not saying it's always going to lead to that, but that's such an outcome that I don't want. I, like, I hope that having these conversations can spur other conversations, or at least create space where we can just openly, hey, how you doing? You doing okay? And being sincere about it, being honest about it, and making it so that people feel comfortable sharing with each other, you know?
I honor that, man, and my condolences definitely to, having experienced that happening as well in my time, especially with males. It is, you definitely want to be able to let people know that you are there, I think, that they don't have to be alone, in their battles, and you're right, like, there's no way to know if it's all, chalked up to your experience with masculinity or what, but I definitely can see that as being, um, a major pressure, especially for people who see that defined in a certain way that they're not living, that they don't find achievable right now. And this is what I was saying earlier too, and part of the reason why the value of these conversations is so important. There's a whole younger generation growing up right now, post-COVID kids, you know, that are already having, in some ways, stunted interpersonal relationships from how that went, and remote and Zooming and OnlyFans and all the other things that kind of disrupt some of our normal human patterns for growth in that time period while we're defining who we are, and our values. And when you're seeing all this, like, inundation of objectification, sexualization, coupled with the Andrew Tate type, you know, why am I gonna marry? It's better to be an incel. You manifest a lot of hatred, especially toward women. Um, and you see that vitriol online a lot. And then, some of those people do try to date, and then they say insane shit to their potential partners because they are living in a cesspool of insanity a lot. And I don't know. It's all very complicated, and it can go very deep, but what's happening is that this is happening to people in their own little silos of information, a vertical sort of manosphere hate mongering that allows them to find not only the ideology but the justifications for it in a circular sense. And that to me is also a very scary proposition. Because
Yeah,
also
and
those people are very easily moldable, once they're in
yeah,
that position.
dude, once you're in a vulnerable emotional state, you're not willing to explore it and discuss it and try to figure it out. Like, boy, that can really, really set you back, and just open you up to opportunities. And you know, there two things relative to that. Um, Netflix just published their the Manosphere documentary, or Inside the Manosphere, whatever, right? And I think when these things happen, they have the tendency to inform the broader ecosystem of people about a subset of the population, but in a way that makes it feel more pervasive than it is. And so, yes, millions of men fallen victim, or are a part of this, or however you want to frame it, but it's still a small percentage, right? As I heard a professor once say, never have a absolute statistic without a relative statistic, or a relative statistic without an absolute statistic. If it's 50% of 10 people, is very different, right? And if it's 1% of a billion
I do
people,
think
it's very different.
I do think that it does move the Overton window. It does move it shifts the realm of acceptable behavior in some sense. I find this a lot with video games. Like people used to say that all the time. Oh, they're just, especially in the chats in the video game, men, especially young men, saying horrible, racist, homophobic things to each other. That desensitization, even though it's just a game, does spill over. And there's no way you can tell me that it doesn't. You know what I mean? Like it shifts the window of acceptable behavior.
Yeah,
Just
I
a little
mean,
bit.
look, I was just, get a slight derail on politics. I was talking to a family member this morning about the signatures Donald Trump wants to put on money. And it's like any other past president wanting to do that, it would be an absolutely abhorrent thing. Now it's just like it's a small thing relative to, you know, some of the other things that we see, and to your point. But I guess my point on the statistical relevance to it is that's, to me, part of the importance of exploring it and having that conversation, because you need to recognize, one, that the manosphere isn't all men. And we need to be able to explore that with each other to say, oh, yeah, we're not that. This is what we expect out of us. Like, this is our expectation. That is alien to us. Oh, okay. So that's meaningful. That's meaningful data in your own world, relative to your exposure in your understanding of what is real versus what is promoted. But if we allow that to create a narrative that says this is pervasive, then it influences how we approach random men, or how we create our social experiences. Because let's say we show up, take Nick's example of doing a jujitsu. If he shows up to that space, which he kind of did, expecting this hyper masculinity, violent ecosystem, it influences how he processes that space. It turns out that was the opposite of what he experienced. But we're not all going to get this group of people that are vulnerable and open and sharing and there for one another. And then we tell stories, we fill in gaps. If we don't talk about it, we fill in gaps, and we navigate that. But then what it also does, is the second point I was going to make, is it influences what we expect then of our leaders, right? And who we select as our leaders. Are we okay with somebody who is a is willing to shed a tear without seeing them as weak, right? Is shedding a tear over lost soldiers in a war weak, right? Or is that strength? And this is then what we start defining in how we see the people we don't know. And we judge because we've created this large narrative that says this is how you are supposed to act. And even if we don't, well, but I would never be. So that I don't need to worry about my type of personality being in that position. Like, I don't want somebody from that ecosystem running shit, right? Because of the dangers and implications that would have on the rest of us.
And is that a question that you feel like people are really asking themselves? Because this is also what we talked about with Nick, is that it is cyclical. It is something that goes and ebbs and flows. And there was a time where, men were more softer, more effeminate. That was a more popular form of masculinity at the time. Then it goes harder, then it comes back. And I feel like right now we are experiencing a shift toward the, authoritarian, firmer style, as opposed to what many people who are the authors of this shift, or who are the lead voices of this push, were felt like, or complaining about, that they were experiencing, right? The loss of male identity and masculinity through, whatever people they want to blame, feminism,
Right. Sure.
transgenderism, whatever. They have a lot of a lot of reasons
A lot of,
why they believe that that's
yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
Uh, but I do think it is also a question about the scale of those, because we are living in a different world. We are living in a world with internet and AI and futuristic possibilities about how information is presented and manipulated. Like, for instance, I grew up around the time, and I don't know if you remember this guy on the radio. There was a dude named Tom Likas, very macho, women are stupid kind of 90s, early 2000s talk radio. So like this stuff has always existed. It's not, you know what I mean? It's kind
Yeah,
of my point.
totally.
It's
Totally.
always part of the zeitgeist. It's always part. But right now you're seeing such a broad breadth of it, and you're seeing it take so much oxygen of an already really diverse media landscape that I worry about how deep it goes, because there's so much stuff, much more stuff to consume now, but yet these are still highly, highly popular entities. And is that,
Yeah.
to your point, is it because of the coverage? Are we paying too close of attention to it and thus amplifying it, or is it a justified amount of coverage based on how much is being consumed?
Yeah. No, it's such a, and I think that what you just shared represents the meaningful value of having this conversation. Um, because there isn't, there's just going to be a natural experience for us as people when we think about what society is. We've talked about the Dunbar number in the past, where we've been socialized with much smaller experiences and exposures to other people. So there is an ease to integration and an ease to assimilation in those spaces that is not present in our current connectedness to, we'll say, 200 million other people here in the United States. And those 200 million people are, you know, neurologically wired for 200. And yet we're sitting here trying to make that magnitudes larger. That's the instinct to define, right? And I think for me, navigating this conversation is is an instinct to refine placement. So this can exist. Nick even talked about it. Like, look, there's role for strong, hyper masculine spaces in certain circumstances and contexts. But there's also place and value for sensitive and more vulnerable male experiences, especially with each other in the right context and circumstance and situation. And our need to expose all of that to say, we can't have one definition. What we should have is one set of expectations of behavior, and define it based on circumstance. And those circumstances can be variable. And this is where it gets so hard and it gets so complicated and so difficult, but it also creates the necessity for not being so unilateral in our positions, saying you must, and if you don't, you're broken. It's like, nope, we just don't need that. It's not healthy for our evolution.
That's exactly why it feels so performative to me. It's like, bro, you cry. You know what I mean? I'm pretty sure you cry.
At least at some point you're going to.
It's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with it. Just be real. Don't have to be
I think what's yeah, I think what's interesting is to explore, the impact of technology a little bit further. But we're at time. I don't want to overdo this, but I do think I'm really curious to dig deeper into your experience with masculinity and what that's looked like in your social ecosystems as well. But let's see what next week brings us. In the meantime, let's wrap up so we don't bore the audience anymore. And we need to get to your spot. We need to get to your singing.
I know, right? Are you guys ready? This is a More Common podcast. I'm Garen Taylor. That's Keith Richardson, and we'll see y'all next week. Now stay tuned for the show.
Pantalla, listos, arrancamos con el participante número 4. Buenas noches, Tijuana. Sean muy concisos y breves con el aplauso. Atención ustedes son el jurado. Aquí